Have you ever had a premonition, a feeling that something dreadful was about to happen?
Horror film scores have gone through a significant evolution over their 100-plus year history. Its earliest pictures predated sound on film even, so they would have had their musical accompaniment played ad hoc by the musicians of the picture houses displaying them. These earlier entries, bringing to life the horror stories of classical literature like Dracula in Nosferatu or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, began to give way to more modern themes and narratives with continued innovations in visual effects, allowing science fiction to become a significant thematic influence on the genre by the 1950s. While earlier Golden Age scoring gravitated around late Romantic and operatic traditions, 20th century concert music was continuing to innovate around harmony and texture, and horror film, with all of its associated tension and drama, was arguably a pretty valid suitor for this material. By the 70s and 80s, in large part due to the slasher subgenre, boundaries continued to be transgressed in film through the artistic and social taboos of heavy gore and displays of sex and eroticism, more often than not between teenagers or young adults. Quite appropriately, the introduction of the synthesizer to film scoring ensured that the accompanying scores were also continuing to innovate. And by the 1980s, synthesized sounds were pretty ubiquitous across Hollywood scoring. But this was perhaps most prominent in horror, thanks in large part to John Carpenter's pioneering work for Halloween in 1978. The budgetary implications of independent horror pictures, where B-movie style gore and jump scares can be attained without the high production costs and inflated salaries of all-star casts, which meant that the scores were also produced equally frugally. These budgetary implications kind of steered the ship of horror scoring for a significant time, whereby only much higher budget horror and thriller scores and pictures like Alien, Jaws, Silence of the Lambs, could continue the orchestral tradition in that horror context with that full symphonic language. Pictures with synth-led or completely synthesized scores were arguably much cheaper and required less people to produce them, again outlining the significance of John Carpenter's Halloween, where he lent his talents to both directing and scoring duties. By the mid-1990s, large-scale orchestral scoring in horror had become somewhat uncommon, with Marco Beltrami's score for Scream in 1996 being a standout example of 20th century modern orchestral music, lending its chaotic and expressive weight to Scream's otherwise quite humorous and self-aware meditation on the genre.
This isn't a movie.
It's all one great big movie.
But the turn of the millennium saw an altogether more silent and unseen slasher. What was originally written as an X-Files episode treatment, Final Destination was picked up as a feature-length in 2000. It follows a group of teenagers led by Alex, who, after cheating death as a result of his premonition,
Have you ever had a premonition
of a catastrophic plane crash, are picked off by this invisible killer, later revealed to be death itself, reclaiming its victims one by one. Having its stylistic roots in the slasher genre, but reintroducing an altogether more classic sense of tension, devoid of tired jump scares, and filled with very novel and elaborate death scenes, quickly became a cultural phenomenon, producing 4 sequels over the following 11 years. But little is discussed about its incredible score by Shirley Walker, one of the earliest pioneering female film composers, and noted not only for her compositional ability, but also conducting and orchestration. She was actually the first female composer to compose, orchestrate, and conduct her own score for Memoirs of an Invisible Man in 1992. Her other notable works include the co-composition, orchestration, and conducting of many of Danny Elfman's earlier scores, including Batman and a number of Hans Zimmer's early entries. During her career, she was a mentor and a guide, opening up opportunities for many younger composers coming after her, while sadly never quite attaining any of the accolades that many of them went on to achieve themselves. She was seminal in the composition of the DC Comics sound world, including Batman, Superman, and The Flash. Amongst her TV work, her music for the first 3 Final Destination films were only a handful of scores she had the chance to compose before her death in 2006. Very little is written about them academically, and they never seem to fare very highly on top horror score lists, and perhaps for a number of reasons. We're still somewhat early in the process of the emergent female film composer, despite the mark they've made already across the industry. We're a long way from any semblance of gender parity, and before Pinar Toprak's scores for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the top grossing films with female composed scores were The Vow and Dear John. Hardly household names, and unfortunately that extends to the names of the composers themselves. Whether historically a predominantly male Hollywood power structure employed female composers only when they needed to due to perceived risk, or the budgetary implications necessitating a lower profile composer, or maybe there just simply weren't enough of them to go around, the reality is that between 2013 and 2016 female composers accounted for only 2% of the top 250 grossing pictures. Because of these historic imbalances, female composers disproportionately contributed to lower budget or independent pictures, and perhaps horror's intersection with these budgetary implications is where we land on Shirley Walker's score for Final Destination. But what little output Walker had either the chance in her career or the opportunity from investment in her talents to compose, it's certainly some of the best and is beloved amongst its smaller fandoms and followers. Walker's score for Final Destination in particular may not be instantly recognizable, but I believe this might be specifically why it's so great at what it needs to be and do for the film. So, film scores are an inherently companion medium, while music is, of course, its own art form, and music for film is often released in isolation. Film music is, at its roots, synergistic. There are great scores that are deemed to be so because they're memorable and iconic in isolation, perhaps due to its melody, or how the music's general memorability reacts with the picture in its original context. But equally, there are iconic films that are so in spite of their score's relatively low profile. In its original context, a score may be just as profoundly impactful in its supporting role, never quite drawing attention to itself, consistently and unfalteringly servicing the requirements of the film in tone, in atmosphere, and in action, to name but a few. If the score of an iconic film is forgettable, it's done its job in supporting that film to attain that status, while not detracting in any way from its success. A good example of this, I think, in the horror thriller context is the score for Seven by Howard Shore. It's a relatively atmospheric and compositionally quite minimalist and amotivic score, supporting an arguably iconic picture. And at times it's not entirely dissimilar to Walker's score in its atmospheric devices, but particularly in terms of its relative forgettability in its original context through its covertly supportive role, and never, perhaps, has music's ability to blend into the filmic backdrop, becoming its key strength, been as effective as when that score's raison d'etre is describing the unseen, unheard, but ever-present death itself. Walker's score for Final Destination rests on her primary skill of orchestral composition and arrangement. She writes almost entirely without synthesis or music technology elements, so it's in effect stylistically quite retro in its approach at this point in the horror genre. It begins with an overture of sorts, perhaps in itself a callback to an older Hollywood convention, and the score does quite the same in its evocations of an older horror. Most, if not all, of Walker's melodic and harmonic devices are revealed in this overture, and they begin building that ever-present tension from the outset. Tension in the unseen is a key thematic constant. In the absence of a killer, becomes a character in its own right. And despite the painfully millennial aesthetics of the surrounding picture, its obvious compositional influences allude to Bernard Herrmann, particularly his work with Alfred Hitchcock, perhaps the greatest wielder of on-screen tension. Well, one of. A As horror is now so interreferential in nature, particularly in the wake of Scream's very self-referential backbone,
It's a scream, baby!
Final Destination is filled with horror Easter eggs, and it's Steve Stifler's character of Billy Hitchcock that solidifies Alfred and Bernard Herrmann's influence running throughout the DNA of the picture. Herrmann utilized, if not authored, a great many of these techniques to portray this element of suspense, and Walker was able to continue that spirit of unease. The main title cue begins with low, ominous woodwinds playing in G. By the second phrase, we hear that we're actually in G minor. So the non-diatonic B natural here, rather than B flat, gives us a sense that something is untoward very early on. A small crescendo in horns playing a minor third, perfect fourth, minor sixth, then up to the octave, gives us a solid G natural minor key center, taking us into the main theme on cello. The main melodic tension comes from the use of the minor second and major sixth degrees of the scale, neither belonging in G natural minor. It sounds kind of modal, and this relative incompatibility is further embellished by the bass's movement to B natural rather than B flat, with the returning root note of G causing a minor sixth dissonance on a dominant downbeat. The chromatic mediant movement to the B natural, along with the loose ends of the melody, perfectly portrays the film's idea that these young lives have somehow broken free from death's ominous intentions and are now wandering aloof where they shouldn't be. The continued movement to E minor rather than E flat is another chromatic mediant, and it means the out-of-place notes are now the B flat, D, and A flat. And if voiced as a G sharp, the A flat provides a very confusing allusion to a major third over a minor chord. The last E natural note of each repetition now has some compatibility with the E minor illusion, signifying in some way that as the phrase draws to a close, the underlying harmonic plan of Death's construction is catching up with these loose ends, returning them to some semblance of order as the phrase draws to a close, or in this case, as they return to the grave. This is further confirmed by the movement to G minor in the last chord, and the melody stops short of the major sixth, resting instead on the note before, the diatonic root of the key. All is as it should be. This is a masterful distillation of the main thematic content in a single musical phrase. So it's little wonder that the majority of the rest of the music in the film focuses around this with only a handful of embellishments. Most notably, there are some beautiful Herrmannisms in the dissonant sforzando-like swells in flutes and violins. They're centered around a minor second clash before resolving diatonically again, signifying an ever-encroaching closeness of death, even when hiding away in the higher register. And following this, there's an amazingly delicate pursuit of sorts, symbolizing a shadow or an ever-following presence. The cue then ends with Death's low register woodwinds, reinforced and strengthened by tubas and bass trombones, as all of these loose ends are tied in the return to G minor. The main theme is cyclical and with minimal variation, but its dissonance over the chordal movements provide that ominous sense of foreboding, particularly played in low register cello and violas. Walker was herself a cellist and felt that the sound of death would naturally lie in low register strings. She was quoted as saying, "In the film, the death presence becomes a trickster with a very mean-spirited sense of humour. The low strings were the perfect choice for that. Never is that dark sense of humour more present in the score than in the cue departure, when in Alex's premonition,
Have you ever had a premonition?
the passengers are scrambling for their oxygen masks, and the sadistic clown-like march Walker creates is almost laughing maniacally at their panic. Equally dark is the repeated soundtrack placement of John Denver's Rocky Mountain High, Denver himself having died in a plane crash, and perhaps used most effectively during the death scene of Miss Luton. She dies while listening to a beloved song from her childhood, just as she's about to leave her childhood home for the last time, and it's pretty graphic. Nice death. Walker's most obvious Herrmannisms come in the cue early exit. The almost polychordal movement in woodwinds and arpeggio on Celeste allude to the octatonic half-whole scale and the augmented symmetrical scale used by Herrmann throughout his repertoire, particularly in his score for Vertigo. That now canonical sense of disorientation from that picture through the use of those scales is put to really good use here during Alex's disorientation as he wakes up from his premonition.
Have you ever had a premonition?
It's even in the same key as the Vertigo prelude, bordering on a direct harmonic quotation. It also kind of harmonically alludes to Herrmann's score for The Twilight Zone.
Up there in the vastness of space, in the void that is sky.
They're using a diminished scale. While there are slight tonal differences between all of these scales, they can all effectively be assembled by stacking multiple chords with varying intervals, creating disorienting chromatic dissonances. As the ruckus and chaos ensues, the pulse on timpani and bass drum return, along with the main theme on cello from the previous cue, make us believe that we are on this inescapable journey, that Alex is going to meet that fate immediately, only for it to then be interrupted by a violin glissando as Claire and Todd also exit the plane. So in a way, this gliss kind of symbolizes Alex's premonition itself, with that glissando cutting through Death's ostinato, sabotaging its plan. The major thematic break from this kind of death theme comes in the cue The Parents Arrive. This kind of string adagio of sorts, with all of its expressive phrasing and suspensions, is very poignant in scoring a very tender moment of reunion. And some of the parents are bereft of their other children, some of the children are bereft of their parents and are kind of all alone, namely Claire, who then has to return home alone, given a lift by Alex's parents. Both of their isolation in the car is scored with this very delicate conversation between solo oboe and clarinet, and kind of quite effectively describes both of their isolation in that moment. One of the very few instances of music technology elements comes with the cue Who's Next, which outlines Carter's nihilistic attitude towards his absurd situation, putting a number of his classmates in mortal peril as he does so. Perhaps by the year 2000, in much the same way as historically the electric guitar came to symbolize teenage rebellion and attitude, the edginess of 90s industrial music was deemed by this point to be a more contemporary alternative, and the film itself kind of confirms that. Pictures in my head of the final destination. Thanks, Trent. While in isolation, the beats kind of age the picture, ironically far more than the kind of retro stylisms of the surrounding score. Thankfully, the film's final mix is much more forgiving.
Car, what are you doing? Car, slow down. Slow down!
In amongst the frantic orchestration of the action and death scenes, Walker alludes very subtly to death's omnipresence by injecting small little motivic cells of the main thematic material, punctuating close-up shots of death's very graphic handiwork, like the tightening of the cord around Todd's neck in the shower, Alex's evasion of death's very meteorological powers while locked away in the cabin, or the police pursuit at the end and its dramatic recontextualization of the major sixth trumpet line. The surrounding content of these cues is comprised of all of the functional horrorisms that you'd expect to denote urgency and tension, like stabbing string staccatos, perhaps in itself a reference to Herrmann's work for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, particularly in the context of this shower death scene homage of sorts. Elsewhere, there are lots of frantic high-string glissandi playing upper harmonics and plenty of irregular percussive punctuation. These are more archetypal devices now at this stage, rather than cliche shortcuts, as they serve a very direct signifying purpose to the viewer to evoke a sense of tension and urgency in these sequences. After the final dramatic peak of Alex's supposed final cheating of death and his savior of Claire, the lack of music is quite notable, as we see 6 months have passed with the characters not succumbing to their pursuer. However, death begins taunting again in the needle drop of John Denver's track, this time being played by a street performer. As Alex begins to recount Death's plan, the main theme begins to fade in incredibly subtly during this realization, signifying that there is no escape, as we now know. It's up for debate as to why many of Walker's scores, in particular those for Final Destination, didn't attain the same level of recognition as the film it was written for. Perhaps, as discussed earlier, its very covert support of the then very novel filmic content allowed it to go under the radar, but in the best possible way. However, lower budget and independent pictures often don't get an isolated release of their score, either on streaming or traditionally CD vinyl, often only securing that release much later when studios and publishers respond to community outcry, usually for films with cult followings. Even then, though, the commercial incentive to do so must be present for it to be a worthwhile endeavor, regardless of its cultural significance. The cultural significance of all of Walker's scores in the context of her unique position in film history is ever present. This is especially so as light continues to be shed on the disparities in opportunity, and as those who have broken through are championed for the representation that many would-be composers need to feel before envisioning themselves in the industry. What's clear, though, with this score is that Walker's channeling of Herrmann and others feels masterful, borrowing his colours but never verging on pastiche. Her covert presence and voice in these scores, much like Death's presence in the film as an unseen, unheard character, or in this case, undervalued composer, is a cornerstone of the film and is a key component in its success, whether we knew it or not. So, thank you if you've made it this far. Stick around for part 2, exploring the main action cue for the very first premonition scene of the first entry in this franchise. It has a bunch of those Herrmannisms and a lot of Walker's own language, and it was really, really fun to reconstruct. So stick around if you want to see an exploration of how she does that in practice. Please like, comment, subscribe, share it around, ding the bell to get notified, and I'll see you in part 2. Okay, so we're going to go through the cue departure. It's where we don't know that he's in his premonition, but it's the initial takeoff scene. Originally, in context with the film when it first came out, we would have thought what we're seeing is what's happening. So as there's not too many idiosyncrasies in this cue, I figured we'd just go through it instrument family by instrument family. As always, we'll have a full playthrough and have a little look at what makes it a really interesting cue. It's a fun one for sure. So this is Departure by Shirley Walker. Okay, so it's a really fun cue. There's that kind of maniacal clown-like thing that we discussed earlier at the end, cruel, dark sense of humor. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. To start with, the chord progression is exactly the same as what we have from the overture. It's that G minor, B minor, E minor, chromatic median kind of movement. Very disorienting, particularly with the kind of embellishments in the higher register as well, particularly in the woodwinds, that minor second clash as well. So we'll go through that. We'll start off by listening to what the woodwinds and the strings are doing in the higher register earlier on. So we have this element of chromaticism here in flutes, which is pretty consistent. That sounds Lydian, but I think it's more a function of that augmented symmetrical scale that's going on here. But to have something so bright over this very ominous, brooding kind of pulse in the lower register woodwinds and strings, I think in itself is kind of a disorienting juxtaposition there. And then we get this kind of run embellishment into that main theme coming back, this time played on bassoon and cello in unison. Move up to the B, E, and back to the G. So it's that cyclical kind of repeated narrative of these loose ends who are slowly just being pruned back by death's ominous undertones. So in trombones and kind of lower register horns here, we have a doubling of the main motivic content, which is now playing, I think, in unison between woodwinds, brass, and strings all together, just adding such weight to that symbolism of that death marching underneath. It's inescapable. There's so much chromaticism going on in the higher register with that major sixth oboe and flute. So many loose ends there by the end of bar 23, with all of this kind of intersecting motivic content and counterpoint. One thing that I absolutely adore about this takeoff sequence is that you can see visually by the tempo map that we are literally ramping up in tempo as their altitude kind of climbs in the plane, and it gives this lovely kind of roller coaster, inescapable kind of sense that they're locked in. They're in it for the long haul, if you will. Yeah. I mean, we're hitting almost 100 beats per minute here, and I think the overture at the start of the film started at around 50, so we've literally doubled speed here. 100 BPM in isolation isn't all that great, but it's all relative. So I also love that these string runs here are literally tracing up the tempo change as well. All completely chromatic. That's a whole half step again, one of the scales that we discussed earlier. It's kind of an octatonic half whole scale, but she's only really using the first kind of 6 notes of it. So it's kind of a hexatonic derivation of the octatonic scale. I don't know if there's any symbolism in the number 6 there, who knows. Now I have to hone in on what is clearly one of the biggest Herrmannisms here, very psycho-derived. It's this kind of chromatic run-in. And then we have a kind of minor second tremolo, and I think a major second tremolo underneath it. And that again is indicative of a half note dissonance and a whole note dissonance kind of in conjunction with each other. It's quite polychordal, very modern sounding. And we have all of these overblown woodwinds and harmonics, upper harmonics being played really, really up there on violins. And we have a fake out moment, and this is where the action starts. So Walker is able to beautifully trace action here, almost like a John Williams-esque level of minutiae of detail that's being reflected sonically from what we're seeing visually. There are tremolo string runs outlining the rickety buffeting of an overhead cabin door. Just so the minutiae of detail is just really impressive. Not to mention the initial grabbing of the armrest of the seat. It's just one beat to breathe, and then the panic floods in. It's amazing. So these are the stacked chords, I think, of the augmented scale. Kind of an interval of a major third, but then another one stacked up an interval of a minor third. So we have this chromatic dissonance here, but it's effectively stacked major intervals at a minor interval apart. It gives a very unsettling feeling, particularly as it's drawn out into this tremolo kind of string line here. Just completely induces a panic. It's wonderful. Again, tracing the on-screen movement of the chocolate falling down onto the floor. And then we have the oxygen mask kind of sub-sequence here, and it really is between the snare drum being used and the bass drum almost being used as like a one-man band or like this clown-like kind of march. And there are these kind of comedic trombone lines. Here we have an augmented here with a major 7, and then chaos ensues. I had to add a little tubular bell onto my orchestral template as well, because there's just a very subtle little hit here, which of course all of the deathly connotations of the tubular bell. You probably wouldn't hear it unless it was pointed out. It just punctuates with that snare really, really sharply as the fake out moment comes to an end and everybody realizes, oh shit, something's happening. There's a lot of kind of doubling of these passages throughout the different families of the orchestra when that segment of the motif is symbolic to a character, in this case, death's unseen kind of influence. And then by doubling, you're able to kind of really thicken the texture and add more emotional weight to that symbolic idea, I guess. I just want to try playing it in context with the original sound design with most, if not all, of the music kind of isolated from it. The visual and audio kind of juxtaposition there of this kind of jubilant takeoff and this very, very ominous and very, very serious music. That juxtaposition in itself is a kind of maniacal turning of the knife there by death. You can tell it's almost enjoying it. Alex is from the reality of the music's description of what's actually going on and how doomed they all are. So he kind of acts as a conduit for the audience to input themselves into the dread of that situation. Not only the dread that he's feeling around anxiety to fly, but the overall doom of the situation. Just on a minor technical standpoint then, the swell samples I have as part of my brass sample library weren't really playing dice, so I did have to double up on the ensemble patch and just split those swells out. I wasn't able to get a long enough MIDI region for the swell to start and end without the end kind of prematurely triggering the end of the next swell sample, so I just had to split those up and make sure that I mixed them both in the same way, but it's a little bit more effective now. Sounds completely atonal in isolation, but there's theory there, I swear. So that was Departure by Shirley Walker for Final Destination. Really, really terrific cue. I didn't really have a full grasp of how it made that scene so effective. It's kind of an infamous scene now at this stage in the franchise and in horror more generally. And again, the covert nature of her score there kind of eclipsed by the very new visual content of the film at the time. So kind of went under the radar, but those juxtapositions and that harmonic language is so effective at instilling that maniacal, ironic dread that just sort of permeates the scene. You really do get the idea that someone is looking down, laughing at them, all helpless. So I'm really, really looking forward to doing a couple more homage pieces to Walker and by extension Elfman and Herrmann. Just really disorienting harmonic and melodic language, which I can't wait to incorporate into some of my own writing. So thank you so much if you've made it this far. I hope you've enjoyed. As always, like, comment, subscribe, ding the bell to get notified, and I will catch you in the next one.